Just wait a few seconds before, so you can get seated. China is the world's most populous country. It has a fast-growing economy, although maybe it's gradually slowing down. But as a result of this, China is the largest energy consumer in the world. And the increasing demand for energy has made it into the largest net importer of oil. I think 2014 will make this shift, as China is the biggest net importer in the world. Only 20 years ago, China was an exporter of oil. This development is also likely to continue. The annual energy outlook projects that China will import 65% of its oil in 2020. This has severe implications for China and for the rest of the world. For the world markets, this means that China will drive the demand and also formulate the prices. So China is, although Norway don't sell much of its gas and oil to China, China is importing so much, they formulate the price also of Norwegian oil and gas. For China itself, this means that they are increasingly dependent on external supply, and the Chinese government try to reduce this dependence or manage this dependence in different strategies. One is, of course, to develop strategic partnership and investments abroad, and we see this in Africa, in the Middle East, in Latin America, in Central Asia, in Russia, and in Australia, among other regions. In addition, of course, this oil needs to be brought back to China. So this has significant implications for piping and also for transport, for maritime transport. And much of the oil has to pass the very important strategic area of the Malacca Strait. In addition to this, of course, energy efficiency and increased focus on renewable energy is also a part of this whole scheme of energy import in China. So energy issue in China is not only about energy politics, it's very much about or energy has become one of the key drivers of Chinese foreign policy. And this is the topic of today's speech. We're very fortunate to have David Zweig visiting us. In 2005, he wrote an article in Foreign Affairs. It's called China's Hunt for Energy. David is the director of the Center for Environment, Energy and Resource Policy at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. I was in Hong Kong and we met at the China Club and had a great conversation there. He's not only an expert on energy, he's also a leading expert on Chinese foreign policy in general, and is also accepted today after his presentation to answer questions more generally about Chinese foreign policy, and also the issue that David is one of the leading experts on, the fact that Chinese want to bring Chinese back to the mainland itself. So David, it's a pleasure to have you here. He will give a speech, we'll show some slides and take us into the field, and then Stein Sundsøl Eriksen, one of our researchers, will make some comments, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers. Thank you so much, David. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Does this work? Yes. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I thought you did such a good introduction about the topic that I don't need to give it. Hitting all the key points, which is good. Right. I wanted to talk today about the sort of the general situation of China and its search for energy, the pressures that it gets, and by and large the difficulties that it confronts. But this is this slide describes, I think, some things that are a little more special about China, which makes China's efforts to get energy somewhat special. Some of these are negative, some of these are positive, but the Chinese state is clearly more actively involved than most other states, helping its companies do business search for oil. They offer the infrastructure for energy swap, which, while can be criticized, I actually think is a pretty good deal, because at least it leaves something behind and doesn't put money directly into the pockets of the leaders, which then winds up going into Switzerland. As you may or may not know, the president of Angola is the third richest man in Brazil, right? And I think his daughter owns half of Portugal or something, or she buys up banks. Also, you know, the China, because it came in late, has had to work with what the Americans would see as pariah states, Sudan, Iran, and that this creates for China a serious dilemma. And then that whole question of the rapid growth, as we'll sort of describe, you know, 1993, China was still, for the first year, in 1993, China for the first year had to start to import oil. That's not so long ago. And since then, it's moved so fast, and the demand has grown so quickly. I think has created a lot of anxiety in the world, which I'll talk about a little later. Now, again, there are lots of reasons for anxiety. First is the supply lines. Though it's, you know, we were talking about this yesterday, you can't blockade the Malaccas. The Chinese talk about the Malacca dilemma, but the truth is you can't blockade the Malaccas. The American Navy admits they can't do it, but as somebody said, you could put ships off the coast of China if you were in a war over Taiwan and block the ships coming in, so you could make life I think that's a more realistic, but we call it the Malacca dilemma. It's really the supply dilemma, the sea lane supply dilemma. The third point is a point that, in fact, I'm editing a book that's been accepted. I call it this resource diplomacy under hegemony. The argument being, the difficulty for China is that it becomes enormously needy of energy in a system that is still dominated, but it's a still unipolar system. You know, you can talk about it moving towards bipolarity, moving towards multipolarity, whatever. It's still a system where the United States is the dominant force. And the United States is the dominant force in almost every sphere, still, even with the 2008 crisis. But it's changed, I think, somewhat since then. But nevertheless, you know, as China goes to search for oil, the Americans can play an important role in many of those bilateral relationships. And we'll look at that a little bit more later. Many of the places where they do the deals are quite unstable. No, I mean, they're more and more becoming dependent on Venezuela. I think they're up to over 5% now of their oil imports are from Venezuela. Not a very stable place, right? Hasn't been for a long time. Iran, you're under pressure from the U.S. to cut back. Sudan now hasn't shipped any oil in 2 years, which surprised me when I looked at the data. They can't get it out. The civil war has basically stopped the flow of oil out of Sudan. Many people don't know that. You just don't hear it. But there's zero oil coming out of Sudan. And then the hot spots, we saw China having to send ships to Libya to carry out withdraw 30,000 people, the largest lift out or any kind of activity like that the Chinese have had to do in their history, certainly since the establishment of the People's Republic. It's not an easy world if you're sitting there looking out from the Chinese perspective. Human security, the Niger River Delta, one of the major oil centers of the world, is one of the most unstable risk places. The probability of kidnapping is pretty good. I keep trying to persuade my mother-in-law to go there for a vacation, and the fact that I offer her a one-way ticket makes her suspicious, and so she hasn't taken me up on it. But any of you who are thinking about mother-in-laws, good vacation site. You know, the demand for energy is far beyond what they can supply, and so you know, they have to be busy. So, what drives this? Resource diplomacy, the search for energy. My own view is that, well, it's pretty obvious, the need for growth, but I also add in here what I like to call the social contract. Down here, the social contract between the Chinese Communist Party and the middle class of China. I believe that in the 1990s, there was a significant shift in China, where the Communist Party had always talked about the worker-soldier-peasant alliance, or the worker-peasant alliance, and that the basis of support for the Communist Party, it claimed, was the proletariat. Well, Jiang Zemin changed all that. Jiang Zemin, the president of China in the 1990s, changed all that. He made the basic social class that was supporting the Communist Party, made it the middle class, capitalists. Every small and medium-sized enterprise in China was privatized, largely taken over by the managers and the party secretaries, the senior engineers, and those guys made a lot of money. And that's the basis. You know, he created this new concept which everybody laughed at, called the three represents. And in fact, the three represents basically said that, flipped who the basis of support for the Communist Party was. That the party relied now on the leading elements in society. So I'm drifting off just a bit into a little lecture on Chinese politics, but that's really became important. And so for the Communist Party stability now, it's much more important to be able to keep the middle class happy. The deal is, we keep you happy, we build you can build your life, you can travel, you can go overseas, you can have a car, you can have a house, all of that. You can have that. Just don't mess with us. All right? You mess with us, we'll mess with you. Otherwise, let's keep going. Everything's cool. And I think that's really, really an important part of this whole energy growth in China. Strategies, well, they've got a lot of them, and they've been working on them for about the last 10 years. China, about 10 years ago, started to think seriously about what it needed to do to maintain this energy, the inflow of energy. Key thing has been the diversification of suppliers, but the truth is you can't diversify that much. There's only certain places you can go because it's a resource that has finite developers, right? The pipelines, busy with that. You've got to improve your technology, improve your efficiency. Some of that is easy. Just close the window. Right? I think at one point McKinsey suggested that someone with a screwdriver, this would be more 10 years ago, but someone with a screwdriver going around to a few buildings in China could improve energy efficiency by about 10%. For those of, I was a student, Ulf didn't say this, I was a student in China in 1974. When Mao was still alive. So I've seen these changes, and, you know, in terms of just having a screwdriver can make a big difference. Energy sources, strategic reserves, that's something that China has been working on very strongly with, and with Saudi support largely. And then strengthen the Navy. One of the things in that foreign policy article that I wrote back in 2005 was I said that if we think about now energy as the driving force behind Chinese foreign policy, what would we see? And I said we'd see a major role for the Navy. And the Navy played that role superbly. The Navy utilized that opportunity to strengthen itself, the opportunity of energy security and making energy an issue of national security. And it was able to use that to develop the Chinese Navy quite a bit in the last number of years. So here's a very nice map from Andrew Speed, and you can see the flows, right? The risks, the spots, the pipelines, still busy, right? Still busy, and they're still got more to come. Now, I borrowed this idea from a paper I read, which was basically tried to talk about diversification. And in general, the finding is that overall, not much change. You can see the percent, and the solid line is the variation in dependence on different countries. How widespread can China go to other places to get its energy source, and still pretty dependent. And I mean, if you think about natural gas, you've got even fewer choices, right? So you've got to deal with that. Now, going back to this point of U.S. hegemony, one of my arguments, and it's the basis of this book that'll be out soon if I can get everybody to finish their give me their last revised chapters. If any of you think about editing books, don't. So the argument here is that when China looks to cut a deal with other countries, there's an invisible actor at the table, and that turns out to be the U.S. I'll leave the slide there long enough for you to. So what I often talk about is imagine that China has a date with a country, right? And they go out and they have a nice time and drink good food, eat good food, drink good wine, go home, and they're about to sign the deal, right? And the lights are low, and then all of a sudden there's a gorilla, a 900-pound gorilla jumping in the room going, "You can't do that, you can't do that," you know, and it's the United States, and a tete-a-tete becomes a menage a trois, right? And suddenly the Chinese are going, "How did this happen?" Right? That's actually a very popular, this view of mine is very popular in China, largely because China likes to think that the Americans are always trying to make life difficult for them. This whole concept of or containment, that the Chinese always want to feel that the U.S. is trying to contain them. But if you look at the cases, it's not so crazy. Right? Venezuela, when I started talking about this theme around 2007, 2008, Venezuela was the #4 supplier of energy to the United States. And China got almost nothing from Venezuela. Well, we've seen a major shift where China now, the United States imports less oil today from Venezuela than it has any time since the 1980s. That was actually the way the Americans responded to Chavez, was to just cut back. Canada, right? I've searched documents, and the U.S. put out Vice President Cheney. One of the first things he did as vice president was he did an energy analysis, sort of the risk analysis of U.S. Energy, and in it refers to the tar sands as a key point of security for North American energy. So all of a sudden the tar sands become North American energy, not Canadian energy. So people took that as sort of Dick Cheney saying, that's okay, Canada can sell oil to China just as long as they remember that it's our oil, right? That should have gotten a bigger laugh. The third is Australia, which I visited last year to follow up on this research. I have a paper on that if people are interested. The Australians have long felt, I mean, it's a really, Australia's, I'll talk a little bit about it if I don't go on too long. Australia's a really interesting case because there's no other democratic country in the world that has the level of economic dependence upon China as Australia, and yet it has a defense security treaty with the United States. And so that becomes a real dilemma. The Koreans love this theme. They're worth talking, maybe trying to run a conference in Korea about that problem for them too, because the South Koreans, it's a huge problem. And it becomes a problem as China gets bigger and bigger. Nonetheless, getting back to the topic that we're talking about, it really means that the Australians have wanted to be there for the U.S. strategically, and now many people in Australia start to say, well, should we be there anymore strategically? And that's been going on, actually, debate since the late 1990s. Pops up every once in a while. And then Iran, Sudan, China wants to have relations, and the U.S. has an agenda. That's not it's not necessarily, well, in this case, it's a moral or a nuclear non-proliferation agenda, right? So that creates a problem. Now, what kind of impact does this have on the United States and the United States and China? So one of the questions I always ask is, do the Americans actually, I can stand out here, it's easier, I can see what I'm doing. Do the Americans actually pay attention to this? Is it a key issue that the Americans watch? And so if, I've gone into into Washington and talked to people. Blumenthal at the American Enterprise Institute back in 2006 wrote that in fact there would be war. But most people don't feel there's going to be war between China and the United States over energy, but tension in various places. It has led to the expansion of the Chinese Navy, or has been helped the Navy expand. And as the Navy expands, then we've had the pivot, right? We've got South China Sea. All these things can build up. So it's not the energy itself that could trigger problems, but the energy sort of spins into that. There could be, Vietnam is one place where you could see American companies are working in Vietnam. The Chinese don't like it. It's inside the Vietnamese 200-mile exclusive economic zone, but it's also inside the 9 dotted line, which China claims is its territorial waters. So that gets a little concern. The role of the government. In China, there's a lot of debate about the role of the government. Some people say that it's not very significant. If you remember back, at a certain point, we've had three organizations that were responsible for energy in the Chinese government. The State Council, there was a leading group on energy. They really, for a quote-unquote communist country that's supposed to have unified leadership, which maybe now it will, but previously, particularly during Hu Jintao era, the model was a model of what we call, political scientists call, fragmented authoritarianism. Right? Every ministry had its own power, hard for the center to move people unless it really put out a lot of energy to move things forward. Every what we call bumenjui, my own ministry, I worry about my own ministry, and that's just the way it is. And that book, actually, that coined the phrase fragmented authoritarianism, written by Oxenberg and Lieberthal, was a book about energy. So that's interesting. Oxenberg was my thesis supervisor. So all these, on that hand, from that perspective, the government's not so strong. On the other hand, we've found lists. If you go online, you can still find, it's still sitting there online, a list from 2004, then from 2007, the State Council put out a list of countries and a list of products and said, if you go out, basically saying, if you as a company go out, this is part of China's going out strategy, if you go out and you buy these resources or contract for these resources overseas, we'll subsidize you. We'll help you. And I even found it for Hunan province. So even provincial governments have lists to push companies out and to give them financial support when they do this. So this ain't a free market economy. And then, as we talked about, as I mentioned before, the coordination of foreign aid makes a difference. The Chinese leaders, people do this now a lot more than they used to. Someone was mentioning David Cameron goes to China, brings BP, right? Well, the Canadians have been doing this for a long time, and the Chinese do it. Chinese leaders go out. When they go visit, they bring companies with them and try and make sure that those contracts are signed when those trips happen. Looking back a bit, the foreign ministry was pretty open-minded about working and trying to make sure that the Straits of Malacca were open. Cui Tiankai, who is now the Chinese ambassador to the United States, that's where he is, his post now. This was a speech he gave in Hong Kong that I attended. And so, the government is aware of the problems of the Malacca Straits, even they may overplay it, and there's concerns that becomes more difficult to buy companies. To one of the strategies being you want to buy shares or you want to buy companies in countries that produce oil. My understanding is you guys are wide open here. Well, the Canadians, the Americans and the Australians have all introduced more rigorous evaluation, Foreign Investment Review Board evaluation of projects. And WikiLeaks let it be known in Australia that though the Australians said this was not targeted at China, Australian diplomat went to the American consulate, American embassy, and said, we are introducing a stricter system to target China. And WikiLeaks shared that. So that can't make the Chinese feel so good. Company interests, major players. All right, we know that. And the size of the companies, their revenues, huge, but they still have lots of weaknesses. We were talking about this, about going into the Arctic, for example. The Chinese don't have they want to get in there, they don't have the capabilities. All right, so there's lots of places. Why are they in Venezuela? One of the reasons people said they went into Venezuela was to get the tar sands technology so that they could then use it in Canada. They just didn't have that technology. And sometimes it goes a little problematic for China. In Australia at one point, there were 90 Chinese companies waiting to strike deals. And that will make a country nervous when all of a sudden, there's 90 companies waiting to make energy deals or different kinds of deals. So again, that reflects a lack of controlled activity. If you were smarter, if the Chinese were smarter on this, if the Chinese government was smarter, they would have held back some of these companies and said, this is just too much for Australia to handle. So I talked this a little bit, just here you can read through this fairly quickly, just statements that showed that from around 2002 onward, and there still are quotes from, I think the last quote I could find was 2011, talking about the importance of energy as a security issue for China. And these are people you can see the words that pop up here, right? Strategic. And when you say strategic, you're basically meaning military. Right, from the Chinese perspective. Security. Is this, here, good. 2010 was the last one. With our naval strategies changing now, we are going from coastal defense to sea defense. Chinese naval force should develop large, apply information technology, be comprehensive. They need to do it to protect their national interest. The 2008, they were going to build a tanker fleet. This has been a debate within China. I found it interesting. I went to give a talk at the Chinese Institute for Contemporary International Relations, also known as KICKR, right, which is the think tank for the Antranbu, the State Security Bureau. And a researcher there thought that they wouldn't build an aircraft carrier. So it was interesting that he was completely wrong. Chinese, not an insider, but a Chinese analyst was completely wrong. Maybe he was, and I don't think he was lying to me. I just think he didn't know. And so you've got this whole question of then enhancing naval cooperation with the United States. That could be a strategy that China would apply. The Americans have actually made some good offers. The 1,000 Fleet Navy at one point, the bottom part of the slide, China just hasn't taken the United States up on that. They just don't trust them. So the think tanks back in 2003, there was a group of think tanks. These are articles that we found in Chinese magazines, military magazines, outlining meetings that were held back in 2003 where the Chinese really recognized that there was a problem, and they wrote it down. And these were the three issues that they raised. And here again you see these two words, U.S. contain. Right? That always goes together for the Chinese. Right? Yeah, here's statements. Just you can read this stuff. It doesn't matter. This is the popular anxiety. This was a survey I did. I just share this. A survey I did of 700 university students in China in 2006. We did this sort of surreptitiously because what I did was I got my Chinese colleagues who were teaching courses in international relations to pass out the survey. Right, so I didn't have to get permission to do it, and people were very interested. Students were interested. They saw energy at that time as a crisis, right? but they worry about becoming independent. Will disagreements over energy lead to military conflicts? You've got 68% of Chinese students in 2006 saying yes. That's a fairly high level of concern. These are all international relations students at pretty good universities too. And the other thing was, do they care about the states that China buys oil from? And they appear to. Do they care about the nature of the importing, the state from which they're importing? And they seem to care. So if you got Chinese students and start talking to them about the bad guys in the world out there, the Chinese students might say, hey, it isn't so good that we're doing deals with Iran and other countries like that. These are students we also surveyed in Shenzhen, and they think, what position do you think China should adopt towards Japan in their discussions on the oil and gas field in East China Sea? And you can see that even among students, pretty hard line. I always say, just take a Chinese and scratch them, and all of a sudden you see something that says, I hate Japan, right? Can't get it out of them. External perceptions, no. The U.S. doesn't like you can remember the Unocal case where the United States blocked the sale of an American company to a Chinese company, and one of the big arguments for it was that the Chinese company didn't have to pay real dollars, that they got subsidized. Well, we know in fact they did. They would have. The state will give them money. But one of the things on an earlier slide, which I think is important, is that Chinese companies are much smarter, and maybe it's morality too. They're much more willing to recognize the rights of national oil companies. So, for example, in the case of Venezuela, when Chavez wanted to nationalize some of the American companies, the oil fields, he called the Chinese in and he said, look, we're going to go to where you can only get 40% equity. You can't own the company. We want to own the company. Will you accept the deal? And the Chinese said yes. Now, they could do it because it's good business, because that's how they get access. And so much of the oil in the world is actually owned and controlled by national oil companies in the developing countries. On the other hand, I think that the Chinese have a greater sense of, developing states trying to have control of their own resources, and not having multinational corporations having complete control of those resources. So I think that's one of China's advantages too. Other views, U.S. Congress, you go in there, can often be hostile, though not as hostile. So it depends. It depends. There's a commission in the United States, which I call the I Hate China Commission, meets regularly and puts forward presentations about why China is so evil. U.S. military, it's an interesting discussion. My former student, who worked in the Defense Department and who's now the ambassador to Myanmar, when he was in the Defense Department, talked about China, but the United States not so worried about China's search for energy around the world, that it was much more concerned about naval power, strategic issues, and that they can live with China going out and getting energy. And that, in fact, some people in the United States have argued that it's good for the United States to have China comfortable, getting the energy it needs, being stable, not necessarily supporting pariah states, that all that has a positive spin for the United States. And that on the U.S. administration side, it really is the worry about pariah states. So let me talk about three countries in brief, sort of as the case studies, and then we can sum up. So here was the case of Venezuela. China initially was hesitant, little hesitant, and every time Chavez would come to China, he would talk about things like, it's great to be here, we've been under U.S. domination for so many years, now we can sell our oil to the Chinese fatherland. Right. Immediately after that, the U.S. Congress did an investigation. What would happen if Venezuela just cut U.S. off completely? Right. But the Chinese have step by step become more involved in Venezuela, and there was a worry, as it says in the third fourth point, there was a worry at one point that if the opposition had won, they would have revised the contracts. So there must have been a period of time when the Chinese were quite nervous that maybe the deals they had been cutting in Venezuela and the opportunities that they had, that they would start to lose those. But things are okay. But they're not getting. It's hard to get oil out of Venezuela these days, from what I understand. And also it is the U.S. backyard. And there still are comments. You can find comments where the Republicans were saying things like, you know, we should still remember the Monroe Doctrine, and so you know, we shouldn't let communist China and Morales and Chavez and those guys make deals in our backyard. So there still are voices that you could hear voices within the U.S. Congress. Angola. Well, let me just say Venezuela becomes, in my model, when I talk about the three sort of the U.S. The U.S., China, and then the third resource-rich state, right? There's kind of this triangular model, right? So it's China, U.S., and then Canada, Iran, Venezuela. Venezuela, as a case study, in some ways represents the pariah states. It's not really a pariah of the Americans, but it is to a certain extent. Chavez particularly was doing things to annoy the United States. But there you could see that as a pariah state in trouble with the U.S. or choosing to have an antagonistic relations with the U.S., China becomes a really important player, and that there's a kind of a shift for Venezuela, and you can see it. Iran, right, the pariah states, Sudan, they move towards China because they need to protect themselves from the United States. Because the United States has declared them as pariahs, and they can worry. Angola represents what I call the neutral states, where there's a lot of neutral states out there that just don't pick sides so much and are looking to do business, and to a certain extent will manipulate both the United States and China. And Angola is a classic case, I think, of a state that's done a very successful job from its perspective in manipulating both the United States and China, and particularly taking advantage of China, because when the Civil War ended around 2002, and the president of Angola was looking for money, the first place he went was to the IMF, and the IMF said, "You want loans? Fine. Open your books. We want transparency. We want to know where the money's going." And so Angola went to China and said, "Will you give us money?" And China said yes. "And do we have to open our books?" And China didn't ask them to open their books, which I think is unfortunate. I think that China benefits from a more open, more transparent system. In the end, Angola just tore up some contracts anyway with China after the Chinese had paid $1 billion for the deal, right? Getting really close with that camera. It's okay. So the Angolans have gotten a lot of money from China, and now about 2-3 years ago, about 2-3 years ago, the Chinese started being not as nice to the Angolans started being not as nice to China, and made life more difficult. And here's Lucy Corkin, was a specialist on Angola. Little evidence to support continued preferential treatment at the bidding table for Chinese oil companies, after China had in fact really gone out of its way to be helpful to the Angolans when the Angolan president wanted money without having to show where it was ending up, right? I love this map. Again, that's the vacation site right there, right? For those of you who don't know. But I always, as a China specialist, we never knew where the Gulf of Guinea was. But if you do pay attention to this aspect of China, you need to know where the Gulf of Guinea is, right? And it's right there, and there's all that oil, right? Right, well, just the fact that the Angolan government did a really good job of managing has been able to manage China quite effectively on this. And the waning influence, right? Sophisticated balancing game, just that DeSantis decided that he wanted more distance from China and has turned back to the West. Though he does it at a time when the United States doesn't care so much, because the United States, one of the big changes in all of this is that the United States, after worrying about China in Africa to a certain extent and worrying a little bit about Nigeria and all of this, now the United States' share of imports from West Africa is dropping dramatically. Major, maybe 60% drop in the imports from West Africa. The last case I talk about would be Canada, which is my own home country. At one point, China was very keen. The Canadians were very keen. The Chinese were very keen to talk about a pipeline coming out of the tar sands going to the West Coast that would supply largely China. Then the new prime minister came in, and the only thing he wanted to talk about was Chinese human rights. And he paid a price for it. Does that sound familiar? Am I speaking to an audience that understands that problem? And basically, the Chinese government told the Chinese oil companies no deals. No deals with China, with Canada, off the table. And for about five years, deals were very hard to discuss. No major deals, really, until the prime minister went to China. Finally, when Jiabao says, "Welcome, it took you long enough," right? Which was a good embarrassment for the prime minister. Then he told, in Guangzhou, he made a speech, and he says, "We're open for business," right? And so then you get there after ignoring the new interest. And so you get the largest energy purchase by China at any time, the Nexen oil company, for $16 billion, right? And a real interest in the tar sands again. Now, there's domestic reason. I mean, it's a complicated location to get this, because of the tar sands. Some people say you want to go south, and then you get into the U.S. politics of Keystone. And we do know that the Americans have spoken about these deals, but not the administration. But there have been members of Congress and former government officials who have said things like, you can sell to China, but just remember that you have to take care of our interests first. So the Americans, they're there. I'm sorry, Cheney. No, this isn't Cheney. This is more recent. Yeah, Cheney, of course, would say that. And so you get this whole question of the pipeline coming down and then the pipeline going west, because you've got two women who are running the two provinces. You've got one woman running Alberta. It's the first time, I think, in Canadian politics. You've got a woman premier of Alberta. You've got a woman premier of British Columbia, and they can't cut a deal on how to bring the oil pipeline through to the West Coast because the people of Vancouver don't want oil spills. And so the socialist government in British Columbia listens to that. Now, here's some expressions about concerns. Are we running out of time? How are we doing time-wise? Okay. Yeah? Still interesting? Yeah, okay? Yeah? Okay, just trying to check. So here's some quotes from some studies. I think this first one is very interesting. For Canada, China is as politically sensitive as it gets. The political concern starts with the nature of the Chinese regime, a non-democratic communist dictatorship for over 7 years. There is an inherent distrust of the regime among many Canadians as manifested in its investment relationship with China. That's a pretty amazing statement from the Conference Board, which is a pretty reliable, slightly to the right, but pretty reliable organization, right? A survey in February 2012, 1 in 10 respondents thought the Chinese companies taking majority controlling interest is a good thing. So only 1 in 10, right? Thinking that's a good thing, right? The Canadians, basically, and it's the same for the Australians. If you want to invest in our country and open up some new green belt, welcome to the Chinese. If you want to buy a foreign-owned company in our country, that's okay. We'll switch it's not as good, but we'll live with it. If you want to buy a local company, basically, we ain't selling. That's the basic view in Australia and for big companies in Australia and in Canada. That's basically my findings. There's Cheney's energy security. Here, Alberta Premier Ed Stelmach said American government officials have raised concern about a pipeline in the Pacific in terms of, well, are you still going to be able to supply us? Bill Cohen, who was a former Secretary of Defense under Clinton, said that oil partnerships must be done with some diplomacy and care that isn't a threat to the United States. Canada can do whatever it wants, but knows it has a very close and vital relationship with the United States. I'm sure there will be discussions, right? And then Eddie Goldberg, who used to work for Chrétien, basically told the Chinese, the Americans to bug off. We're not the 51st state. It's not the business of the United States to decide where Canada sells its resources. So there is an issue there, right? And here's the survey. Majority interest Canadian company, majority interest foreign company. And so let's look at this. Very bad. And so very bad. Majority interest in Canadian company. Right, and bad. So there you have a very strong negative view of buying up, of China coming in and buying a Canadian, wholly owned Canadian company, right? But it's okay if you want to do startups. We'll take your money, we just don't want you to own our companies, right? Which is very nice. So the Nexon sale went through, but it went through, as the Prime Minister said, approved with new guidelines that allow future purchases under exceptional basis only. And this is largely because they're state-owned enterprises, right? And the view is that the state-owned enterprises are controlled by the state, which to a certain extent they're influenced by the state. They may not be controlled. But on the other hand, some heads of, the way the Chinese political system works is that today you can be the head of a Chinese oil company, and next round you can be the party secretary of a province, right? And that kind of movement happens. We've seen it with Li Peng's son, where he goes from being the head of Huaneng to becoming a vice governor of a province. Huaneng was China's leading domestic energy company, and then moves from there to become the vice governor of a province. And we've seen the same thing with heads of oil companies moving into provincial leadership. So it is a system. The organization structure in China does move these people around in ways that makes them closer to the party. This is just a quick, for Australia, surveys that show that the Australians feel 56% feel that the Australian government allows too much investment from China. So, conclusion. China's using SOEs, if that's what they have, that's a problem. I think that creates a serious difficulty, particularly in democratic countries. It may not make a big deal for countries that aren't democratic. They may not care, but it is a problem for democratic countries. And Australia and Canada are two of the main suppliers. You guys too, but somehow you don't worry about that, which is interesting. Much of the oil is in neutral countries, which will go back and forth. You got to make deals. The case of Angola should make China a little nervous. You can get this slide. You don't need to take pictures. If you have people who are taking pictures of this. China is increasingly forced to rely on the spot market. They're becoming more and more dependent on Saudi Arabia. People talk about maybe within the next 10 years, 50% of China's energy coming in from Saudi Arabia alone. You work with pariah states, the Americans are definitely there. And you work with American allies, and the Americans are definitely there. And that really becomes a difficulty. Okay? It's my years in China. Right?
Okay, thank you. And then
do you want this? Or are you going to just use?
No.
Yeah, better. Is that okay? Yeah. Is it a problem? No? No?
Does it work? Okay, I think it should be good. Thank you very much for an extremely illuminating and interesting lecture. I have been told to be brief, and I think that's good for at least two reasons. I think the longer I speak, the more my own lack of knowledge and incompetence would be revealed, so it's better to get it over. But most importantly, it will give more time for questions and discussions later on. Since I am no China expert and no energy expert, I think I will try to raise a couple of more broader issues and questions that struck me listening to your presentation, and then ask a couple of more specific questions. So first, the broad issue about how to understand energy policies. I think you indicated three possible frames through which energy policies should be explained. The first is as a security issue, viewed mainly then as a potential conflict area between states in a broadly geopolitical understanding. The second is to look at energy mainly as a commodity or as an economic issue, where the main question is how energy will, or how China will get its energy in order to sustain its economic growth patterns. And the third issue that you touched upon, but without expanding too much, was how energy via economic growth becomes an issue of domestic legitimacy. You said that the Chinese Communist Party in recent years has come to rely on the sustainment of economic growth in order to maintain its legitimacy. So my question or comment on this is, how do you think these three concerns relate to each other in understanding China's energy policies? Do you see it mainly as driven by the wish to promote and sustain economic growth? Or how is it related to security questions on the one hand and questions of domestic legitimacy on the other? Because even in security terms, that could also be seen as a way of sustaining legitimacy, because it can invoke nationalist sentiments and promote the legitimacy of the regime through promoting China as a great power. So that was my first comment. The second one concerns what you addressed about what you called state weakness in terms of energy policies. That seems a bit strange, given the extraordinary activities of China in the energy sector and the emphasis that has been put on energy issues in Chinese policies. It also raises the question about the relationship between the government bureaucrats, the administration and political leadership on the one hand, and the energy actors and the state-owned enterprises at the national-owned oil companies. To what extent would you consider the national oil companies as a part of the Chinese state and as part of the government's strategy to promote national energy policies? That's the second question here. You indicated, I think, somewhere that it can be discussed whether the government controls the oil companies, or to what extent it's the other way around, that the oil companies significantly shape and influence the government in its policies there. Is it a question of, to what extent can one say that it's a question of, well, the tail wagging the dog? We have that discussion in Norway as well concerning the role of Statoil. I mean, is Statoil a company owned? Is it the state's oil company, or is the state Statoil's state. So some reflections regarding the relationship between the state companies on the one hand and the government on the other. Thirdly, you mentioned these, you showed these surveys of students, which to some extent showed a gap between what the students' attitudes were and the government policies, especially concerning the importance of political regimes and human rights and things like that in the countries where China engages. How should this be interpreted? Is this, do you think, an expression of a gap between the government and the population? Or is it perhaps that the students, there's a kind of a shift in the views of the Chinese population, which may lead to a change in in how the government deals with these things as well? Or could it also be that such a gap could create problems of domestic legitimacy for current Chinese oil policies, or foreign policies in general, I guess? Because they seem to stand in some tension with the quite strong emphasis that China traditionally has had on the principle of non-intervention and of not concerning itself with issues such as democracy, political human rights, and internal political developments in partner countries. Finally, one question that you didn't bring up, but which struck me especially when you talked about Canada here towards the end, it's what would the impact be, do you think, of the recent developments of shale gas and new sources of energy, which could have major implications on global energy markets and the global security policies surrounding energy issues? I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, okay, maybe you can sit over here. And then,
Should we sit far apart? So critical, I feel.
Okay, thank you so much. Very good questions, and thank you, David, for a very good presentation. You stayed post for big questions. Maybe you should start by answering them.
Sure.
We'll give it a try.
Is this on? Yeah. Thanks. I wish I had more time. The first question was very comprehensive and not so easy to answer, which is pulling together the whole question of legitimacy, economic development, and security. And I started to try, if I had the time, I would have tried to map it out in my head or draw something up and sort of figure out the ways that they interact. But I think that they clearly, are highly interdependent. If China wants to, if the assumption is, and I would say the bottom line is, growth is necessary for legitimacy of the party. To get that growth, they need energy. To get that energy, they need to they recognize that it has become an issue of national security outbound. Internally, it's also a question of national security, right? The stability, legitimacy is a huge issue of national security anyway, because China actually spends more money on internal security than it does on external security. As of 2011, China's this money spent on internal security surpassed external security, but so security is a big issue for China. But as you need to get that energy to go out, then the world changes, right? And that actually plays back into I think one of the other questions. I'll see if I can find it again. But that plays back into this whole question of going out, the company's relationships. I mean, and you're asking me the question about non-intervention. I mean, all of these things are the result of a decision to go out and join the world. Non-intervention. It was easy to say we don't support intervention when you had no global interests. The only intervention was sending Maoist, supporting Maoist guerrillas, or the Marxist Leninist Communist Party against the Soviet Communist Party. Other than that, China didn't have much to think about the world. Now, all of a sudden, the world for China has changed dramatically. It's highly dependent on the outside to maintain its own internal stability. So I think that makes the desire for internal stability, legitimacy of the party, then takes on an external component, and that becomes a security issue, an external security issue. I think that's how I would see it. You look like you want to counter argue. No, okay. On the state weakness, I think that what I say, I think, is not radical within the China energy field. That somehow the state, even though it looks like it's really strong and really well planned, has limitations. That doesn't mean that it doesn't play a role. And as I said in the beginning, it plays probably more of a role than most other states in terms of going out, in terms of going overseas. If you compare it to, the particularly democratic countries, though I'm learning more about your situation. Maybe I need to know more about your situation here to give me another model or another alternative way that the democratic states can do this. But China. The Chinese government is clearly giving signals. It directs, but it doesn't say to the oil company, I want you to go into Angola and buy oil in Angola. What it will say is, if you want to go to Angola, we'll help you. And the Chinese oil companies will say, we're driven by profit. We want to go. We can make money in Angola. We know that the state will be glad if we do this. It's good for my career. If I can be a successful director of CNOOC, it's a good step on my career to move up. I mean, I think that's the way it probably works out. And because there has been no strong leadership on energy in China. It's amazing, there was no leadership. If things are important in China, there's a leadership small group for it. All right? If it's a Taiwan issue, if it's the Hong Kong issue, if it's U.S., almost all the issues, they form a leadership small group. In my area of the other area I work on returnees, the Communist Party, as of 2003, set up a leadership small group on talent. There was no leadership small group on energy. And 3 bureaucracies, the NDRC, about 2 at least, NDRC and the State Council, both had organizations responsible for energy. So there was no coordination even within the bureaucracy. So, that's why the model of fragmented authoritarianism seems to work well for China. Maybe it won't work under Xi Jinping. Maybe Xi will somehow tighten this kind of stuff up, but it clearly worked in the 80s and the 90s, and then under the Hu Jintao era. Students' views, again, as I said, well, is there a gap? I think there's a gap. I always remember being at a conference on energy at Peking University. Actually, there were 2 things that really were quite surprising, and I'll tell these 2 stories because they're really good. One was a Chinese student stood up. In China, there's a big issue about rivers. Again, we're talking about energy and the importance of rivers for energy and damming, as I like to say, those dams, damming rivers, which becomes a foreign policy issue for China too, with countries in the Mekong, now with India, with all the countries around. But this was just a domestic dam, and a Chinese student stood up and just started denouncing the Chinese leadership for supporting a dam on the Salween River coming down towards Vietnam because it was destroying historical villages and stuff like this. And it was strong enough that at one point Wen Jiabao stopped the project. So domestic opposition on kids, the students in China, there's our students in China who pay attention to these issues, and they were strong enough opponents. They're likely to go down. A group of them from Peking University could go down to the dam and protest. Maybe they'll get arrested, but they know it's going to happen. But that's an issue that they will strike on that. So the students disagreeing with or worrying about the the nature of the partners isn't that strange, or isn't as strange as one might anticipate. And yes, the whole question of intervention is a real problem, non-intervention. Once you decide to go out, you know, the going out strategy just changes the deal, right? You got to worry about it because your people are getting kidnapped. And I think that the Chinese really have to worry about the stability of the regimes, and that they should want to see, again, one of the findings from this book is we came up with this view that it really is to China's benefit to argue with these governments and say, look, you know, let's have more transparency, spend the money in a better way. We'll give you money, but we'd like to see you do this, or we'd like to see you do that, which I think is okay. What was the other? There was another story I wanted to tell. Oh, I have to tell the story. We still do. What time do we have till?
I think we should end in around 15 minutes. So there are some interest for questions. So if you have a very good story, a short one, you can take it now. Otherwise, you can kind of save it for responding to some questions.
Okay.
If that's okay for you.
Sure.
Okay, because I think we start with some questions, and we have Leif Lunde over here in the back first. Please identify yourself, and please also ask short, brief, good pointed questions.
Thank you. I have a comment, and thanks for a very interesting presentation and comments. I think overall, especially with the developments we have seen over the last years in the global energy markets and in global politics, you present maybe a too negative picture about the relationship between China and the world, and also China and the US. If you look at developments globally and also with regard to US interests, I can see much more kind of a benign picture with regard to commonalities between what is in the US interest in terms of global energy security and what is in the Chinese interest. I think when Stein, you asked about the implication of the shale gas revolution, the US is getting far less dependent on energy imports. It will still remain very interested in freedom of the seas. China is exactly as interested in the freedom of the seas. The US and China have identical interests in keeping trade open, and also in keeping Saudi Arabia stable and able to supply energy. And I think it's just excellent for the US that Saudi Arabia and others are able to provide China with oil and also LNG. And also the LNG revolution, which I think will get a further impetus with what is happening in Europe and Russia today. There will be more and more LNG available also from Africa from other countries. So that is beneficial for China, and it's definitely also a positive seen from a global US perspective. So I of course, one can easily also get naive about these positive aspects, but I think it's important not to overestimate and to provide a too sort of antagonistic perspective when there are many reasons why the interest in fact may be becoming much more similar and close to identical on some basic issues. And then about the domestic Chinese developments, my general position is that China is becoming much more like other countries in its dealings with the other parts of the world. The Ministry of Finance is not allowing any big adventures in Angola like they did 10 years ago. And you have been alluding to many of these developments, but I think you are not sort of maybe putting forward the full implications of what is happening. The Chinese oil companies are extremely concerned about risk management in all the countries where they are investing, even in Norway. They have problems with the Ministry of Finance, like all others have and should have. But they are concerned about sort of comprehensive risk assessment in Myanmar, in Sudan, in Iran, wherever. And their interests in that regard are coming much more similar to Norway's interest and much more similar to the US interest. So a lot of these factors are driving in, as I can see, in a much more positive direction and undermining some of the basis for what I interpret as a kind of sort of continued sort of polarization, negative, conflict-oriented relationship between the US and China. And I asked the Secretary General of EITI, Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, about Chinese oil companies in Africa. He said they are when in countries where governments are really getting interested in and see the value of transparency, Chinese companies behave like Western companies. just as good as Western companies. So just some issues, both regarding the developments in China and developments globally, that I think deserve further scrutiny and point us towards a more sort of not a zero sum, but a more positive development. Thanks.
So comment, David.
Comment to that? Well, I'm wrong. No, I think that part of this is that I would agree. As I said to you when we met yesterday, I'm not on the ground as much as maybe I need to be. You're on the ground much more in a day-to-day interaction on this. I met with people 2 years ago from Transparency International, and they were very upset about China. So what you describe could be some recent significant changes. I think that I presented this with sort of where the U.S. and China can work together, I think shale. I think that there's been lots of agreements between the Department of Energy and in the United States with China. So maybe I think I wouldn't. I mean, when it comes down to the third side of the triangle, which is U.S.-China competition, I think conflict is far to the edge. And as I edit the book and write the book, I think in the last year or two since I started the project, I would myself have moved the conflict not into a one done, but more cooperation, competition, tension, right, with conflict sort of way at the extreme. I think that's the way I would frame it. And if I didn't frame it that way, I apologize. But that's the way I see it. But I still think that I think the model overall still has some utility of thinking about sort of this triangular relationship, maybe it's lessons that China has learned from like in Angola. Maybe China learned a lesson in Angola, and therefore they know that they've got to think about, as you say, risk assessment. I mean, maybe I'm right. Well, don't I have that book of the fellow from the research? I brought his book. He gave me a book about risk, energy risk. Just came out. And that was his perspective on this, whereas mine was more, yes, a little bit more realist, conflict oriented. But I've moved, and so I would take your point about. I mean, I think your comments will definitely help me write a better introduction to the book, which I still need to do, and I'd want to follow up with you, Leif, on the risk assessment stuff. So thank you.
Okay.
Could I make? Okay.
But then go ahead, and then Leif, can you just bring the microphone down?
Just briefly on the exchange here on conflict versus common interests. I think that Leif's comments regarding the emphasis on common interests
fits your economic model.
Exactly. That depends on whether you analyze the relationship in an economic frame, a security-based geopolitical frame, or a domestic politics legitimacy frame. And perhaps it's the case that there's more common interests in the economic dimensions than in the geopolitical or security-related issues. So.
Well, they are, but at the same time, the overall theme being China being anxious, I think, is still valid, right? And part of that anxiety is the fact that it's a difficult world out there. It's a difficult world out there for the Chinese energy companies, and some of that is security related. And there still is a real worry. I mean, I know that there are Chinese colleagues sitting here, so I'm, aware of that. But I think there's almost a paranoia sometimes about the world, maybe on the security side, and that's where if you talk about the security rather than the energy guys, maybe the companies are out there on a day-to-day basis interacting with Western business people, and they can see that, in fact, I mean, part of the book that I edited really finds that, in fact, and the argument is to be made to the Chinese is stop worrying. You know, look at Venezuela. You know, what did the United States do when China started to move towards Venezuela? It stopped importing Venezuelan oil. It didn't send the troops, right? It didn't try and kill Chavez again, or try again to kill Chavez, right? They behaved pretty benign. And so in some ways, the U.S. can be a pretty benign hegemon. And the Chinese somehow need to believe that the U.S. is trying to contain them. So from that security issue, I think that's still alive. Your answer to his question was better than mine. Thank you.
Okay.
Per Wigen, Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Live partly took my question regarding lesser importance of competition for energy, but maybe it still has some consequences that is relevant, because traditional allies like Saudi Arabia and even Canada cannot rely on the US as a customer anymore for its energy.
Right.
And hence US influence vis-a-vis Chinese influence could be an issue. And one more question regarding the more domestic side of this. The arrest or something like that of Zhou Yongkang, and also the corruption scandals in CNPC. Do you see that, and also the SOE reforms that seem to be moving on, do you see that influencing how Chinese oil companies can operate, and to what extent they can operate independently or more market-based in the future?
Thank you for that question, because I want to share with you one of my own thoughts, which has nothing to do with what you asked. I love the Zhou Yongkang case, and where the Zhou Yongkang case, for me, I've written about the third plenum in some detail. I've spent some time thinking about it, and one of the really interesting things about energy, oil, and politics in China is the Zhou Yongkang case, because what it says is a small group of people who worked in an oil field, a group of about 20 people, can work their way up through the system, branch out, and become a powerful faction with within the Chinese leadership. That's what Zhou Yongkang is, right? They come back, they come out of Shengli oil field, right? And his power base, and he had people who worked with him moved around, right? And why I say that's important, and it was important to knock him off for Xi Jinping. If you go back to 1979, which may be before you were born, but it's when I had already lived in China. In 1979, there was a guy named Yucha Lee, right? Yucha Lee was the head of the State Planning Commission, who had come out of the Dajai oil field, who came out with a group of guys and eventually worked themselves where he went from the oil fields to become the head of the State Planning Commission, when the State Planning Commission was as powerful as the NDRC. His faction controlled the Minister of Energy and would have been in a position as representatives of the state industries to oppose reform. And in the Bohai Gulf, there was a Bohai Gulf incident where a platform flipped. Deng Xiaoping used that, wiped the faction out, right? And was able to push through even faster on reform. And I think that's part of what the Zhou Yongkang thing is, because what's his name, Jiang Zemin, right, who was part of Zhou Yongkang's group, had become the head of SASAC, which is the State Assets Committee, which is the committee that owns all the state-owned enterprises. So you want to be able to push through reform, you've got to move these guys out. And this became, when I saw that happen with Zhou Yongkang, I immediately went, I've seen this before. And at precisely the time when they're trying to do major reforms, you got to move those guys out. So it should loosen everything up.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador.
That help?
Thank you very much, Professor.
Just a second.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor, for as we said, the illuminating lecture for us.
Could you just,
and as well to hear all these stories. One thing is I didn't heard about Iraq. We know that China really import from Iraq will be the third country after Saudi Arabia and Angola. So I was wondering, for all you mentioned many countries, but Iraq was one of the main exporter of oil to China. Thank you.
The only I haven't done any research on Iraq, so I don't talk about it. Mao Zedong once said, "Those who haven't done social research have no right to speak," and therefore I don't talk about things that I don't know much about. The only thing I know about Iraq is that Dick Cheney didn't win. That in fact, not only did they lose the war by and large, but they also didn't get the energy, and that in fact China has done quite well by the reemergence of Iraq as an energy state. So I really am not well placed to comment. If someone else wants to comment on that, I should be, but this is a hobby. Energy is a hobby for me.
Could I have just one question towards the end? Because one of the things that you said towards the end in the conclusion is that China will probably become more dependent on the commodity market or the spot market. The spot market, right? And if you were to speculate a bit about what do you think this will mean for energy prices, the increasing dependence, so kind of the global energy prices. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, if you shift the focus a bit from energy and look into climate politics, pollution, environmental politics, is the energy dependence, oil dependence also driving a shift towards a green economy in China? And how do you see this?
Well, clearly there's been a shift towards the green economy. Let me take it that way. For the last 2 5-year plans, that's been an important part of the program. It was something that Hu Jintao did talk a lot about, but wasn't able to do very much. But I think the big issue is that China, it's easier to rely on coal. And that's a real problem when you've got so much coal reserves and the system is set up for that. You've got to take a serious effort to change it now. Unfortunately, or fortunately to a certain extent, but unfortunately, the coal has come to really, China's paying the price of the coal with the terrible air pollution in North China. But that gives the leadership a boost to really push for even faster shifts to cleaner energy. But it's tough. It takes time. LNG, it takes time to build the ability to unload it, to move it, to use it. China talks about nuclear plants, 40 on the books to do it. I think those are all there. It just all takes time. And I can't talk about prices with Leif sitting here in the room. I just let Leif make the comment about what I just assume that it will push prices up to a certain extent. But the Americans not buying, not having to go out and buy is a huge change. I think that it's a huge change all around. It's a huge change. I just think it's, when you start a project, you got to finish it fast, because if you don't finish it fast, the world can have changed by the time you finish it. I think I wrote the grant to do this project back in 2010 or something like that, and here we are 2014, and there's a major change in the world. So.
Okay, David, thank you so much. Stein, thank you for your comments. And David, we could have probably gone on for a very long time. We have not discussed lots of issues that we have not discussed. For instance, one of the pressing issues these days is the relationship between Russia and Europe, and the potential redevelopment in Russia-China relationship. Also, one of the key issues that are on the agenda. So, but I suggested we just give David a good round of applause, and thank you so much for visiting NUPI. Thank you so much. And could I have just a small announcement? I think we don't have the date set, but I think in May there will be somebody coming from Australia to discuss the issue about Australia energy and its relationship to China. So welcome back then.